The morning of December 20th, 1944. Snow falls thick across the Belgian Ardennes, muffling the sound of tank treads grinding through frozen mud. Staff Sergeant James Bates, gunner in the 2nd Platoon of Company A, 4th Armoured Division, peers through the periscope of his Sherman tank and sees something that shouldn't be there. A Panzer IV hull down behind a collapsed barn, its long-barreled 75mm gun traversing slowly in their direction. His loader, a kid from Ohio named Morrison, has already slammed around into the breach, but it's not the usual armor-piercing shell. It's one of 3 HVAP rounds they received 2 days ago, high-velocity armor-piercing, with a tungsten core that cost more than Bates made in a month. The tank commander told them to save it, use it only when absolutely necessary. This, Bates decides, qualifies. The gun fires. The recoil rocks the turret. Through the dust and smoke, Bates watches the tracer arc across 300 yards of snow-covered field and punch straight through the Panzer's frontal armor. The German tank doesn't brew up dramatically. There's no Hollywood explosion. Instead, smoke begins seeping from the hatches, and within seconds, the crew is bailing out into the snow. Morrison is already loading another round, standard armor-piercing this time. They've learned not to waste the tungsten. But something has shifted in this moment, something the Germans haven't yet fully understood. The Sherman they're facing isn't the same tank that struggled against Panthers at Normandy 6 months ago. It's an M4A3E8, the Easy 8, and it represents a culmination of American industrial adaptation that arrived almost too late to matter, yet just in time to change everything. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened in that frozen field outside Bastogne, you have to go back to the summer of 1944, when American armoured divisions were bleeding in the hedgerows of Normandy and the limitations of the standard Sherman tank were becoming impossible to ignore. The M4 Sherman, in its original 75mm gun configuration, was never designed to fight German heavy tanks. It was designed in 1941, when the most dangerous enemy armour was expected to be the Panzer III and early model Panzer IV. Against those tanks, the Sherman's combination of reliability, speed, and adequate firepower made it an excellent cavalry tank, meant to exploit breakthroughs, not engage in head-to-head duels with Tigers and Panthers. But by June of 1944, the nature of German armour had changed. The Tiger I, introduced in late 1942, mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy a Sherman at ranges exceeding a mile. The Panther, which began appearing in significant numbers at Kursk in July 1943, combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with sloped armour that could deflect most Allied anti-tank rounds from the front. American tank crews in Normandy quickly discovered a brutal mathematical reality. The standard 75mm gun on the M4 Sherman could penetrate approximately 2.5 inches of armour plate at 1,000 yards. The frontal armour on a Panther measured roughly 3 inches, sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of over 4 inches. At combat ranges, the Sherman 75 couldn't penetrate. The Germans, meanwhile, could engage Shermans from distances where return fire was ineffective. A Panther's 75mm KK-42 gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armour at 1,500 yards. A Tiger's 88 could do it from over 2,000 yards. The tactical implication was stark. German heavy tanks could sit in defensive positions and methodically destroy attacking Shermans before the American tanks could close to effective range. This wasn't unknown to American ordnance officers. Development of a more powerful gun for the Sherman had begun as early as July 1942, when the Ordnance Department started work on the 76mm gun M1. The designation 76, rather than 75, was deliberate, though the bore diameter was actually 76.2 millimeters, identical to the 3-inch gun already in use on the M10 tank destroyer. Calling it 76 prevented confusion and ammunition mix-ups. The 76mm gun represented a significant improvement. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped ammunition, it could penetrate 4 3/10 inches of armor at 1,000 yards, nearly double the performance of the 75. More importantly, it had the velocity and ballistic characteristics to engage targets at longer ranges with reasonable accuracy. But there was resistance. When the first 76mm armed Shermans arrived in England in April 1944, senior American commanders were skeptical. The gun had problems. Its high-velocity firing produced a massive muzzle blast that stirred up clouds of dust, obscuring the gunner's view and making rapid follow-up shots difficult. Without a muzzle brake, firing the gun in dry conditions meant losing sight of the target for 8 to 30 seconds, an eternity in tank combat. More significantly, the 76mm gun's high-explosive shell was less effective than the 75's. The 75mm M4A3E8 round contained 1.5 pounds of explosive filler. The 76mm M42A1HE round contained only 86/100ths of a pound. For a tank that spent 80% of its time supporting infantry rather than fighting other tanks, this was a serious drawback. Major General Hugh Gaffey of the 2nd Armoured Division argued against immediate adoption. His reasoning was practical. Crews weren't trained on the new gun, logistics weren't prepared to supply the different ammunition, and the marginal improvement in anti-tank capability didn't justify disrupting established combined arms tactics. Other commanders agreed. When General Omar Bradley's staff offered 76mm Shermans to 3rd Army in mid-June 1944, Patton's officers declined, stating that all of the commanders were reluctant to see it take the place of the 75mm tank gun in any quantity. Not a single 76mm Sherman landed in France on D-Day. Then came Operation Cobra and the breakout from Normandy. In the hedgerow fighting that preceded it, American tank battalions learned hard lessons about German armor. At close range, in the confined spaces between hedgerows, Panthers and Tigers were vulnerable. They could be flanked, hit from the side, or engaged from positions, where their main guns couldn't depress enough to return fire. But in open terrain, the German heavy tanks dominated. The first 76mm Shermans saw combat with the 2nd Armoured Division in late July 1944, during the initial phases of Cobra. Their performance was mixed. The improved penetration was welcome, but the muzzle blast problem persisted, and crews still found the gun inadequate against Panthers engaged from the front at medium to long range. In August 1944, a new type of ammunition began arriving, T4 HVAP, redesignated M93 in February 1945. High-velocity armor-piercing. This was a composite rigid shot, a tungsten carbide penetrator, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and ballistic windshield. The reduced weight meant higher velocity, 3,400 feet per second compared to 2,600 for standard armor-piercing shot. At 1,000 yards, HVAP could penetrate 7 inches of armor, more than enough to threaten even a Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges. There was one problem. The United States had limited domestic tungsten production and relied heavily on imports from China, where Japanese advances had disrupted supply lines. Tungsten was also needed for machine tools, cutting equipment, and countless other industrial applications. By March 1945, only 18,000 HVAP rounds had reached Europe, and 42% of those were for the 3-inch gun on the M10 tank destroyer, not the 76mm gun on Shermans. Tank units learned to ration HVAP like liquid gold. A typical Sherman 76 carried 71 rounds of 76mm ammunition in wet storage racks below the turret floor, plus 6 ready rounds in an armoured rack. Of those 77 rounds, perhaps 3 to 5 would be HVAP. Crew commanders gave explicit instructions. HVAP was only for heavy armour at medium range. Everything else, Panzer IVs, Stugs, half-tracks, bunkers, got standard ammunition. Some units never received HVAP at all. Distribution prioritized tank destroyer battalions, whose doctrinal mission was specifically anti-tank warfare. Regular tank battalions, considered primarily infantry support, got whatever was left over. Sergeant Bates's company received their first HVAP allocation in mid-December 1944, 3 rounds per tank. They'd been in combat since Normandy. But ammunition wasn't the only issue. The Sherman itself needed improvement. The original vertical volute spring suspension VVSS that had served adequately in North Africa and Italy was showing its limitations in the mud of Northern Europe. The narrow tracks, derived from the earlier M3 Grant, distributed weight poorly and led to high ground pressure. In wet conditions, Shermans bogged down. The suspension also gave a rougher ride, making accurate firing on the move nearly impossible. Engineers at the Detroit Tank Arsenal had been working on a solution since mid-1943, the horizontal volute spring suspension, or HVSS. This system used wider track assemblies 23 inches compared to 16.5 and redesigned bogies that distributed weight more evenly. Ground pressure dropped from 13.5 pounds per square inch to 11.5. The ride improved dramatically. More importantly, the gun stabilization system, which had always been temperamental on the VVSS Shermans, worked better with the smoother suspension movement. In August 1944, the HVSS was approved for production on the M4A3 hull variant. The M4A3 itself was already considered the best Sherman configuration. It used a Ford WWII gasoline engine producing 500 horsepower, more reliable than the radial engines in earlier models, and featured welded hull construction with wet ammunition storage that significantly reduced the risk of catastrophic fires, if penetrated. The combination of the M4A3 hull, HVSS suspension, and 76mm gun created the M4A376W, HVSS officially designated M4A3E8, with the E8 denoting the 8th experimental variant in the series. Crews soon shortened this to EZ8, taking the phonetic alphabet designation for E and adding the 8 from the hull designation. Production began in earnest in August 1944 at the Detroit Tank Arsenal and Fisher Body's Grand Blanc Arsenal. By December, roughly 250 EZ8s had reached Europe. It wasn't many by comparison. There were over 1,900 Shermans of all types in Bradley's 12th Army Group alone, but it was enough to make a difference in specific engagements. The EZ8 represented the culmination of 3 years of continuous Sherman development. It retained everything that made the Sherman effective: mechanical reliability, ease of maintenance, excellent crew ergonomics, and the group gyro-stabilized gun system that, while crude by modern standards, still gave American crews a significant advantage in acquiring targets and firing accurately after coming to a halt. But it added the firepower and mobility that earlier variants had lacked. The HVSS suspension alone transformed the tank's cross-country performance. In the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge would soon erupt, the terrain was particularly challenging: steep slopes, dense forests, narrow roads, and now, in December, deep snow and frozen ground. Earlier, Sherman variants struggled. The EZ8, with its wider tracks and improved traction, could go places other Shermans couldn't. And then there was the gun, the 76mm M4A3E8. The version installed on late production EZ8s incorporated several improvements over earlier M1 and M1A1 variants. The rifling twist was tightened from 1 turn in 40 calibers to 1 turn in 32, improving long-range ballistics. Every M1A2 came with a muzzle brake that diverted the blast sideways, reducing dust signature by 70%. Crews could now fire, maintain visual contact with the target, and fire again without waiting for dust to clear. The rate of fire was still the Sherman's secret weapon. German tanks, particularly the Panther and Tiger, had larger guns with heavier ammunition. Loading a Panther's 75mm KK-42 required significant physical effort. The complete round weighed nearly 45 pounds. The cramped turret and horizontal breech design slowed the process. A well-trained Panther crew could sustain perhaps 6 to 8 aimed shots per minute. The Sherman 76, by contrast, could theoretically achieve 20 rounds per minute, though in practice, sustained combat rates ran closer to 10 to 15 rounds per minute, limited not by the gun mechanism but by crew fatigue and the need to aim carefully. Still, in any engagement, an American tank could typically put twice as many rounds downrange as its German opponent. Volume of fire mattered. Even if individual rounds were less powerful, the probability of achieving a killing hit increased dramatically with shot count. This was American doctrine: win through superior coordination, logistics, and tempo, not superior individual weapon performance. But now, with the EZ-8 and HVAP ammunition, American tankers finally had both superior tempo and, at least in certain circumstances, superior individual weapon performance. The German army, meanwhile, was operating on assumptions formed 6 months earlier. Their intelligence had thoroughly analysed captured Shermans from Normandy. They knew the standard 75mm gun couldn't penetrate Panther or Tiger frontal armour at combat ranges. They knew Sherman crews preferred to manoeuvre for flank shots rather than engage head-on. German tactical doctrine emphasised using Panthers and Tigers as mobile anti-tank guns, sitting in hull-down positions and engaging American armour from maximum range. This doctrine worked exceptionally well through the summer and fall of 1944. German tank commanders grew confident, perhaps overconfident in their material superiority. A single Panther in a good defensive position could stop an American armoured advance, forcing the attackers to call for artillery or air support or find another route. The mathematical advantage was simply too great to overcome through tank versus tank combat alone. But December 19, 1944 changed the calculus. That was when the Wehrmacht launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, the massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan was ambitious. 3 armies totaling 30 divisions would strike through the weakly defended Ardennes sector, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest to capture Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and potentially forcing a negotiated peace in the west. Speed was essential. The offensive had to achieve breakthrough and exploitation before Allied air power could intervene or reinforcements could arrive. Among the units rushed to contain the German breakthrough was the 4th Armoured Division, Patton's favourite, now driving north from the Saar region to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. And among 4th Armoured's tank companies were some of the first EZ-8s to see sustained combat. Staff Sergeant Bates's company had received their EZ-8s on December 15th, just days before the German offensive began. The tanks were so new they still smelled of paint and fresh oil. The crews had barely 24 hours to familiarise themselves with the improved suspension and the M4A3E8 gun before they were moving north into Belgium. The HVAP ammunition arrived on December 18th, issued with strict instructions. 3 rounds per tank, use only against heavy armour, account for every shell expended. The loader in Bates's tank, that kid from Ohio, Morrison, had never seen tungsten ammunition before. He asked if it was something special. The company armourer just laughed and said each round cost more than Morrison's monthly pay. The terrain around Bastogne was brutal. The Ardennes forest in winter was a landscape of sharp ridges, narrow valleys, and tree-covered slopes where visibility dropped to 50 yards in heavy snow. Roads were few and poor, mostly farm tracks that turned to frozen ruts. The Germans had chosen this sector precisely because Allied commanders considered it unsuitable for large-scale armoured operations. They were half right. Traditional tank tactics, sweeping manoeuvres across open ground, were impossible here, but the EZ-8's HVSS suspension proved itself immediately. Where older Shermans with VVSS got stuck in snowdrifts or slid off icy roads, the EZ-8s kept moving. The wider tracks distributed weight more effectively, and the improved traction gave drivers confidence on slopes that would have been impassable days earlier. 4th Armoured's drive to Bastogne was a series of small, vicious engagements rather than a continuous advance. German blocking positions, usually a few Panthers or Panzer IVs, supported by infantry with Panzerfausts, had to be reduced one by one. Artillery would soften the position, then tanks and infantry would assault together, the tanks providing direct fire support, while riflemen cleared buildings and trenches. It was in these close-range fights that the EZ-8 showed its real advantage. The combination of HVSS mobility, the gyro stabilizer, and the improved muzzle brake on the 76mm gun meant American crews could shoot accurately from positions where German tankers couldn't. A Sherman could advance to a ridgeline, fire 2 or 3 aimed shots while partially exposed, then reverse down into cover before the enemy could effectively respond. The Germans called it shoot and scoot, and they hated it. On December 20th, Bates's platoon ran into a German blocking position north of Arlon. 3 Panthers were hull down along a tree line, approximately 800 yards distant, covering the approach to a crucial road junction. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Harmon, had fought through Normandy in a 75mm Sherman. He knew the old calculus. At 800 yards, you couldn't hurt a Panther from the front. You had to flank. But now, they had HVAP. Harmon's orders were explicit. Get to within 500 yards if possible. Use HVAP, aim for the gun mantlet, the rounded armor shield protecting the gun mount, which was slightly weaker than the glacis plate and lacked the benefit of extreme slope angles. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The platoon moved forward in bounds, 2 tanks covering while 2 had advanced, using every fold in the ground. At 600 yards, the lead Panther fired. The 75mm round went high-distance estimation in snow was notoriously difficult. Harmon's tank and Bates's tank pushed forward another 100 yards and took up positions behind a low stone wall. Bates had 1 HVAP round loaded. Morrison stood ready with a second. The range was now approximately 500 yards, close enough for the tungsten round to do its job, far enough that the Panther's frontal armor still provided substantial protection. Everything depended on shot placement. Bates later wrote about this moment in a letter to his brother. He described the clarity of it, the way the Panther's mantlet stood out in his sight picture, the cold air making the optics unusually clear, the knowledge that this single shot represented more tungsten than a factory worker earned in a month. He described squeezing the trigger and watching the tracer streak across the snowy field, in what felt like slow motion. The HVAP round struck the Panther's mantlet slightly left of center. At 3,400 feet per second, the tungsten penetrator punched through 80 millimeters of curved armor as if it were cardboard. Inside the turret, the penetrator fragmented, sending tungsten splinters through the fighting compartment at supersonic velocity. The Panther's ammunition racks, stowed along the hull sides in the older configuration without wet storage, cooked off. The turret lifted several inches, then settled back askew. Black smoke poured from every opening. Morrison already had the second HVAP loaded, but Bates switched targets. The other 2 Panthers were traversing their turrets, trying to locate the source of fire. The American tanks were positioned below the ridgeline, only their turrets exposed, and the muzzle brake on the M4A3E8 gun dissipated the signature. The German crews were clearly uncertain exactly where they'd been hit from. Bates fired the second, HVAP, at the middle Panther, again aiming for the mantlet. This shot struck slightly low, hitting the junction between the mantlet and the glacis plate. The penetrator still went through, though at a more oblique angle. The Panther didn't explode, but within seconds its engine compartment was smoking. The crew bailed out. Now Bates was down to standard armor-piercing ammunition. The third Panther, realizing the threat, was already beginning to reverse into the tree line. At this range, with the target moving and partially concealed, Bates couldn't guarantee penetration even with HVAP. He put 3 rounds of standard AP into the area around the Panther's position suppressive fire, not aimed for effect, while the other platoon tanks maneuvered to get better angles. The 3rd Panther escaped, backing into the forest and disappearing down a trail too narrow for the Shermans to follow safely. But the road junction was clear. The platoon had destroyed 2 Panthers at medium range from frontal positions, something that would have been nearly impossible 6 months earlier. Two HVAP rounds, and perhaps a dozen standard armor-piercing shells. Word spread quickly through 4th Armored Division. The new Shermans, with the improved guns and special tungsten ammunition, could kill Panthers frontally at reasonable combat ranges. It changed the tactical psychology. Tank commanders who had spent 6 months learning to fear German heavy armor suddenly had options. But the scarcity of HVAP remained a constant frustration. After the engagement near Arlon, Bates's company received a resupply allocation, 2 HVAP rounds per tank, 2. The Ordnance Officer Apologized Division had requested 50 rounds per tank, but Theatre Supply could only allocate 40 rounds total for the entire battalion. Priority was going to 3rd Army's main thrust into Germany, not to divisions temporarily detached for the bulge operation. This forced a kind of tactical triage. Every engagement required a quick calculus. Is this target worth tungsten? A Panther or Tiger, certainly. A Panzer IV, probably not standard AP, could handle it from the flank. A Stug assault gun, maybe, depending on range and angle. Crews became miserly with their precious rounds, sometimes passing up favourable shots because they weren't sure they'd get resupplied. The Germans, meanwhile, were beginning to understand that something had changed, but their intelligence hadn't caught up with battlefield reality. Captured American tankers were interrogated about the new Shermans. The reports filtered back to Wehrmacht headquarters. Improved suspension, bigger gun, better mobility in snow. But the interrogators focused on the wrong details. They noted the wider tracks and asked about ground pressure. They noted the muzzle brake and asked about flash signature. They completely missed the significance of HVAP ammunition, partly because captured EZ-8s rarely had any HVAP left. It had all been fired, and partly because the tungsten rounds looked almost identical to standard AP, except for markings that meant nothing to German intelligence officers, unfamiliar with American ammunition nomenclature. German tactical doctrine didn't adjust. Panther and Tiger commanders continued to engage American armor from long range, confident in their material superiority. But now, occasionally, an American tank would fire back, and the round would go straight through frontal armor that should have been impenetrable. German after-action reports from late December and early January expressed confusion. Several reports mention American tanks possibly mounting a new, more powerful gun or achieving unlikely penetrations at extended range. A captured German tank commander, interrogated in January 1945, described an engagement near Bastogne where his Panther was knocked out by a Sherman at approximately 600 meters. He insisted it was impossible no Sherman could penetrate a Panther frontally at that range. When shown photographs of the penetration through his tank's mantlet, he refused to believe it was from a Sherman 76. He insisted it must have been a tank destroyer with a 90mm gun. The American interrogator noted, "Subject appears genuinely confused about the capabilities of late-model M4 variants." This confusion was understandable. The German Army's institutional knowledge about American armor was 6 months out of date, formed during the Normandy fighting when the majority of Shermans still mounted 75mm guns, and HVAP was nearly non-existent. German tactical training emphasized exploiting the Sherman's weaknesses: thin frontal armor, limited gun performance, tendency to burn when penetrated. These weaknesses were still real, but they were now partially offset by improvements the Germans hadn't fully recognized. The EZ-8 couldn't win a straight frontal duel with a Panther or Tiger at long range. The German tanks still had thicker armor and more powerful main guns. But at medium range, with HVAP, the EZ-8 could threaten any German tank from the front. and in the close terrain of the Ardennes, medium range was the norm, not the exception. Combat ranges in the forest fighting rarely exceeded 500 yards. Often they were under 300. At these ranges, the EZ-8's other advantages came into play. The gun stabilizer, crude as it was, meant American crews could fire accurately sooner after stopping than German crews could. The faster rate of fire meant more shots per engagement. The improved crew ergonomics, the Sherman's interior was far more spacious than the cramped fighting compartments of German tanks, meant American loaders could sustain higher rates of fire without exhausting themselves. And then there was simple numbers. Even with only 250 EZ-8s in theatre by late December, they represented a growing percentage of American armoured strength. For every EZ-8, there were perhaps 7 or 8 older Sherman variants, plus tank destroyers, plus towed anti-tank guns, plus infantry with bazookas. German armour was always outnumbered, and now they were outnumbered by tanks that were, at least in certain circumstances, their equals. The Battle of the Bulge ground on through Christmas and into the new year. The German offensive failed, stalled by fuel shortages, tenacious American defence, and the weather clearing enough for Allied air power to intervene decisively. By mid-January, the Wehrmacht was in retreat, having lost nearly 700 tanks and assault guns in the operation, losses Germany couldn't replace. 4th Armoured Division's drive to relieve Bastogne became legend, and the EZ-8s that participated earned a reputation. After the Bulge, demand for 76mm Shermans reversed completely. In November 1944, many unit commanders had still preferred 75mm guns for their better high-explosive performance. By February 1945, every commander wanted as many 76mm Shermans as they could get, and specifically requested the HVSS variants. On January 29, 1945, 12th Army Group Headquarters sent a message to all tank battalions. All future M4 deliveries will be 76mm gun variants. No additional 75mm gun tanks will be accepted. It was an acknowledgement that the tactical situation had changed. German armour was now concentrated in defensive positions inside Germany, and breaking through those positions required tanks that could fight Panthers and Tigers on something approaching equal terms. HVAP production increased slightly in early 1945 as tungsten supplies from China improved, but it never became plentiful. Tank units learned to manage scarcity. Some developed informal bartering systems. Companies that were reluctant to part, temporarily out of the line, would trade HVAP to companies actively engaging enemy armour in exchange for other supplies or favours. Ordnance officers turned a blind eye, understanding that this unofficial distribution system often got ammunition to the units that needed it most. Sergeant Bates's company fought through the Siegfried Line in February and crossed the Rhine in March. By then, their EZ-8s were veterans, battered and patched but still running. The HVSS suspension had proven remarkably durable. Tracks stayed on even over the roughest terrain, and the wider assemblies were actually easier to repair in the field than the older VVSS bogies. Bates fired his last HVAP round on March 15, 1945, at a Tiger II near Hanau. The tungsten penetrator went through the Tiger's turret front at 400 yards, disabling the tank, though not destroying it outright. By that point in the war, German crews often abandoned damaged tanks rather than risk being trapped when American infantry moved up. The Tiger's crew was gone by the time Bates's platoon advanced to inspect the wreck. He never received another HVAP allocation. The war in Europe ended 7 weeks later, and Bates never saw another tungsten round. But he kept a spent casing from one of the HVAP shells Morrison had loaded back in December. He'd picked it up after the fight near Arlon. Years later, showing it to his grandson, he explained that this single empty cartridge represented the difference between a fair fight and a suicide mission. The Germans never really adapted to the EZ-8's capabilities, partly because they encountered it so late in the war, and partly because they were fighting a losing battle regardless of tactical innovations. But captured documents from early 1945 show that German intelligence eventually recognized what they were facing. A February 45 tank identification manual issued to panzer divisions included a new entry. Sherman, M4A3E8, mounting 76mm high-velocity gun, frontal engagement not recommended at ranges under 600 meters. Treat as equivalent to enemy tank destroyer types. It was a remarkable admission from an army that had spent 3 years convinced of its material superiority over Allied armor. The Easy-8 hadn't changed the outcome of the war by December 1944. Germany's defeat was already inevitable. But it changed the tactical equation, giving American tank crews a weapon that didn't require them to die courageously while attempting impossible flanking maneuvers. The Easy-8's real legacy came after Germany's surrender. Over 2,600 were produced before VE Day, and they remained in service with the U.S. Army through the immediate post-war years. When war broke out in Korea in June 1950, Easy-8s were among the first American tanks rushed to the peninsula, pulled from depot storage in Japan where they'd been maintained since the occupation began. In Korea, facing Soviet-built T-34, 85 tanks in the hands of North Korean crews, the Easy-8 found its perfect opponent. The T-34, 85's armor and gun were roughly equivalent to a Panther's, but North Korean crews lacked the training and tactical sophistication of Wehrmacht veterans. American crews, many of whom had combat experience from World War II, consistently outfought their opponents, and in Korea, HVAP was finally available in quantity. The post-war tungsten shortage had eased, and stockpiles of 76mm HVAP that had been jealously rationed in Europe were now issued liberally. Easy-8, companies routinely carried 20 or more HVAP rounds per tank, a ratio that would have seemed like fantasy to Sergeant Bates back in the Ardennes. Between July and November 1950, Easy-8s destroyed 41 North Korean tanks, mostly T-34, 85 seconds, with HVAP ammunition. The tungsten rounds that had been so precious in 1944 were now standard issue, and they performed exactly as designed, punching through enemy armor at combat ranges with remarkable consistency. The Easy-8 remained the primary American tank in Korea until mid-1951, when it was gradually supplemented and then replaced by M26 Pershings and M46 Pattons with more powerful 90mm guns. But even as those heavier tanks arrived, many commanders preferred the Easy-8 for its reliability, easier maintenance, and superior mobility on rough terrain. The same HVSS suspension that had excelled in the Ardennes snow proved equally valuable on Korean mountain roads. The last Easy-8s were withdrawn from U.S. Army active service in 1957, 13 years after the first examples rolled off the production line. But the design continued serving with Allied nations for decades. Israel received surplus Easy-8s in the 1950s and used them effectively in the Sinai Campaign of 1956 and, remarkably, in the Six-Day War of 1967, where upgraded examples with diesel engines and modern fire control systems fought Egyptian and Jordanian armor. Some Israeli Easy-8s, heavily modified, remained in service as late as the 1973 Yom Kippur War, used primarily as mobile artillery or armored bulldozers. The story of the Easy-8 is ultimately a story about timing and adaptation. It arrived almost too late if the war in Europe had ended 6 months earlier. Most Easy-8s would never have seen combat. If it had arrived 6 months earlier, when American armored divisions were struggling in Normandy, it might have saved hundreds of crew lives and changed the tactical balance in crucial battles. But it arrived exactly when it did. December 1944, just as the Wehrmacht launched its final offensive in the West, just as American tank crews needed a weapon that could fight Panthers on something approaching equal terms. It wasn't a war-winning superweapon. It was simply a good tank, well-designed, properly engineered, with the firepower and mobility to do the job required of it. The tungsten ammunition that made it truly effective was never available in the quantities needed. Sergeant Bates fired perhaps 12 HVAP rounds in 6 months of combat, 12 shots that cost more than he earned in a year. each one carefully hoarded and used only when absolutely necessary. But those 12 shots included at least 3 confirmed Panther kills from frontal positions, engagements that would have been impossible or suicidal in an earlier Sherman variant. The Germans never expected a Sherman to penetrate a Panther frontally at medium range because, for most of the war, no Sherman could. By the time the EZ-8 and HVAP ammunition changed that equation, German intelligence was overwhelmed, German industry was collapsing, and German tactical doctrine was too rigid to adapt quickly. The Wehrmacht fought the EZ-8, using assumptions formed in Normandy, and those assumptions cost them tanks and crews they couldn't afford to lose. In the end, the EZ-8 represented something simple and profound: the capacity of American industry to identify a problem, engineer a solution, and deploy it at scale, even late in the war when victory was already assured. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't revolutionary. It was just competent engineering and adequate logistics applied consistently. The Sherman tank, finally brought up to the standard it should have met in 1943, delivered just in time to matter. Staff Sergeant Bates mustered out in October 1945. He kept that empty HVAP casing his entire life. When his grandson asked why, decades later, Bates explained it simply. "That shell," he said, "was the first time I felt like I had a fair chance. Not a great chance, not a sure thing. Just fair. That's all we needed." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.